Hello, welcome again to our St. Andrew's worship meditation, which I am doing. Sarah, our intentional interim minister, is on a vacation, and I'm filling in. I am Reverend Bob Settle, and I am a retired minister, honorary associate here at St. Andrew's. I'm glad to be filling in for a couple of weeks. Welcome to our worship here on YouTube. We thank Reverend John Crowdis for allowing us to use his video channel, the Accessible Faith Project, for our Sunday worship. Last week, I introduced the Theology of Liberation, and I pointed out that the Theology of Liberation has kind of three main underpinnings: love, justice, and liberation from sin for a new society. Today I want to talk about what the people have been doing or were doing for trying to work towards that new society. The first thing is that they have been clear that in order to make any changes, you have to understand where you're at or what's happening. So they've been clear in their use of the social sciences. Camilo Torres, who I mentioned last week, was a priest who, when he was ordained, went to Belgium and studied sociology in Belgium before he went back to Colombia to work in a number of fields, including educational radio and land reform and a variety of other projects. Others have followed suit with much the same desire to analyze what has been happening, to see where the wealth goes and who has the wealth and why so many people are poor. Elder Camara once commented, when I say we need to help the poor, I get all kinds of praise, but when I ask why so many people are poor, they call me a communist. There have been many people trying to ask that question: why are so many people poor? And many found that the best analysis that they could make was through the work of Karl Marx. And so they have been very clear that it's quite a Christian thing to do, to be able to use Marxist sociology or sciences to study society and to see what the problems were. And so that became part of what they were doing to try to develop a new society. So the first thing was to really analyze society. And like I say, Marxist analysis became part of the way that they did that. In order to make a major change, not only do some people in the church or some leaders need to know what's happening, but people in general need to have an awareness. And part of what happened in developing means for change was through the leadership of Paulo Freire in Brazil in the 1960s. He started a program that was called alphabetization, or teaching literacy to people. And in this process, they found that in 30 days of 1 hour a night of study, that they could teach Brazilian peasants how to read and write. And they could, that those peasants could read and write well enough that they could begin to understand Brazilian law and begin to understand their rights in Brazilian law. In addition to that learning of reading and writing, which I have to admit is a little easier to teach peasants in Brazil and in the rest of Latin America than in North America, because Spanish and Portuguese are actually written like they sound, unlike English and French. so that people who can speak the language can learn pretty quickly how to write the language, and usually don't make very many mistakes once they get the idea. But along with teaching people to read and write, they would help people to understand, and he called it not so much teaching as learning with the people. A leader would work with a group of 8 or 10 people, and they would analyze the society around them and what's happening, and begin to realize, and they would often talk about it as, well, we knew that, but we really didn't say it. We're just kind of getting conscious of the things that we really knew. So they began to call the process conscientization, or conscientization, or consciousness raising, we often call it in English. They had that program going in Brazil in the early 60s, and in order to help with the discussion and just to show slides of letters that could be then spoken to the whole group at once, Czechoslovakia provided several thousand slide projectors to Brazil. In the mid-60s, there was a coup in Brazil. The right wing took over, and they stopped the alphabetization program. Paulo Freire was arrested and deported, and they even destroyed the slide projectors as an instrument of communism. So they saw that as a means of social change. Paulo Freire then went to Chile and was involved in the learning process in Chile as the Chileans became more aware, and eventually elected the Unidad Popular government of Salvador Allende, which was clearly a socialist government. They decided, and the people of Chile decided, or chose for that. The wealthy in Chile didn't like that, and along with the United States, they overthrew that, and with a very repressive regime for a period of time. But conscientization became one of the cornerstones of building. Another means, another concern was to return to one of the church's roots. It goes back to St. Francis and before, a choice of voluntary poverty. And that was seen as a means for a number of reasons. First of all, it was to help the church break itself free from the enslavement to wealth. If the church had wealth, then the church became part of the society that was trying to protect that wealth and trying to keep its hands on it. And so to free itself from that, the best way was for the church to give up its wealth. Many priests did that voluntarily, and they lived very simply. Even bishops, Elder Camara, of whom I've spoken before, and Gerardo Valenciano of Buenaventura are two who had very simple rooms where they lived, and just a small desk to work at, and they continued to. They lived in poverty by choice. That was the first reason was to free themselves from the wealth. The second would be to share some of that wealth with the poor. If the church has wealth and people around the church don't have wealth, then the church can use that wealth to help the poor, and that was a second part of it. A third part would be to identify with the poor, so that the church could be seen not as the church of the society, but as the church of the poor, and that the church cannot be a wealthy church and be a church of the poor. It just doesn't work. So they needed to identify with the poor. And then finally, to protest poverty, not to say poverty is good for anybody, but to say we voluntarily choose poverty because nobody should have to live in poverty, and we should be able to try and change that. And so to protest and fight against poverty, they would they felt that accepting poverty was a part of what they needed to do. Well, as the church did some of these things, like conscientization and certainly social studies that involved Marxism, the wealthy elite fought back, and so there became a question of how do you respond then, and how do you make a change when the wealthy don't want to make changes? And one of the debates became, should we take up arms against the present system, violent revolution, or not? There were those who chose for violent revolution. I've talked about two of them last week. One was Camilo Torres, the Colombian priest. In 1966, he decided that when the bishop told him that he could not do some of the things he was doing because they were too political, as a priest, he gave up his priesthood, and shortly after that, he went and joined the ELN, the Colombian guerrilla movement at the time. Unfortunately, he was much better sociologist than fighter, and in his first battle, he actually was killed. There was another priest, Bolivian, Nestor Paz Zamoro, who was also known as Francisco, who joined the guerrilla movement in Brazil, or not in Bolivia, and in Bolivia, that movement was then unable to get broad support and was isolated, and he actually died not in battle but of starvation in the jungle. But their choice was to fight back against those who oppressed the poor. There were others, and many others, who thought that didn't work. I've spoken of Elder Camara, who probably is one of the great leaders of Latin America. He wrote a little book called Spiral of Violence. And he says the first violence that people have in society, and the first violence we see, is the violence of oppressing people. So the violence of the poor being oppressed by the wealthy, that is the first violence. It's the mother of all violence. There are many examples of it, and it goes on and on and on. And it's very understandable to try to fight against that violence. And so Dom Helder said that he could understand the feelings and desires and means or hope of someone like Camilo Torres to go off and to try and fight to change things. But he says the problem with that is it's never successful. That it can't be violence, that violence against the first violence, the second violence brings on a third violence, violence of repression against those who are fighting back. And that just grows the violence. And so violence begets violence, and you never get anywhere. And so his option was to follow a path of nonviolent protest. And that too was a costly thing. In Brazil, one of the priests that was working with him was murdered by the security forces just because they were working with the poor. And he lived knowing that he was limited. In fact, the government of Brazil wouldn't allow him any access to the media at all because they didn't like what he was saying. The Bishop of Buenaventura, whom we actually met when we were in Buenaventura, he was or one of the leaders of the Lacombe group who responded to the Medellin conclusions. He also spoke of peace and the necessity of peace, that you could not do it by violence. And so he worked very hard at trying to organize for a new society among the poor in Buenaventura and in the regions around Buenaventura, but always recognizing that one needed to, or the most positive way would be through peaceful means. those are the main ways that the people of Latin America have tried to respond. So it raises for us a question, again, how do we respond? How do we respond in a society that is consumerist, that is very divided between rich and poor, that we find that when people, because they are black, start to protest against being mistreated because they're black, are being mistreated further. Even when they have peaceful demonstrations, those are violently suppressed. Where do we stand? And those of us who, like myself, are privileged or white and not among the poor, we do have some questions about what do we need liberation from? Do we need liberation from our own wealth? Do we need liberation from a society that needs to consume more in order to keep the economy going? And as we consume more, we find that we are creating problems like climate change. Or as we respond to a pandemic that we're finding is restricting all of us in many different ways. How do we respond in ways that liberate people and free people to live lives that are healthy and whole, and in which we can all share with one another in ways that are good for the whole community?